The real architects of the modern world never set foot on a battlefield. They were the silent partners of empire, the financiers whose wealth built nations from thousands of miles away. This is the story of how money, not just armies, redrew the map of the globe. By the end, you will understand the hidden financial machinery that dictates global power even today. We will uncover how a single family's loan could decide the fate of a continent, and why the most powerful people in the room were often the ones who never spoke. What does it truly cost to build an empire when someone else is paying the bill? A merchant in 17th century Amsterdam held power not in his sword arm, but in the ink-stained pages of his ledger. His influence stretched across oceans to trading posts he would never see, to conflicts he would never fight. This was the silent partner, a role filled by banking dynasties, merchant princes, and the earliest corporate investors. They were the essential source of capital, the fuel for imperial engines. These individuals were not romantic adventurers chasing glory. They were pragmatic calculators of risk and return, masters of new financial instruments that pooled wealth and spread danger. The joint stock company allowed thousands of small investors to own a piece of a colonial venture, while sovereign debt meant kings and emperors borrowed vast sums to fund their ambitions, binding their nations to these distant financiers. Consider the Fugger family of Germany, who essentially bankrolled the Holy Roman Empire, or the Barings of England, whose loans financed the Louisiana Purchase. Their power was immense, yet it was exercised from paneled counting houses, not palace throne rooms. They shaped foreign policy and colonial administration by controlling the most fundamental resource, money itself. To understand how empire was built, you must first look past the generals and the governors, and into the quiet offices of those who paid for it all. This leads us to a deeper question. What was the true nature of this wealth that could move the world from afar? Gold itself was too heavy, too slow to build a world. The true engine of empire was something far more fluid and powerful, a force called credit. The silent partners mastered the art of leveraging the capital they already held to create vast, invisible lines of credit. This allowed kings and trading companies to spend far beyond their immediate means, to launch fleets and raise armies with money that, in a very real sense, did not yet exist. They dealt in state bonds, which were essentially promises from a government to repay a loan with interest. They issued massive loans directly to monarchs desperate to fund their wars and ambitions. And they underwrote the shares of colonial corporations, turning paper certificates into the timber and sailcloth of real-world conquest. This sophisticated system fundamentally transformed the nature of risk. The colossal cost of planting a flag on a distant shore was no longer borne by a single crown or a lone adventurer. It was spread among thousands of investors, each owning a small, transferable piece of the venture. This not only pooled the necessary wealth but also created a crucial distance, insulating the financier in Amsterdam or London from the physical dangers and moral quandaries of the frontier. Their wealth became mobile and intangible, a web of trust and financial agreements that spanned continents. A promissory note could travel faster than a ship, and a bond was often more powerful than a battalion. This reliance on credit forged a deeply symbiotic relationship between the state and its backers. The crown needed the financiers to project its power, and the financiers needed the crown to protect their investments and grant them lucrative monopolies. It was a powerful alliance, but also a precarious one, for if a king defaulted on his debts, the entire delicate structure could tremble. To see this revolutionary system in action, we must look back to its earliest and most influential architects, the families who first learned how to make money from money on a global scale. A quiet counting house in Augsburg held more sway than many royal courts. This was the domain of the Fugger family, who transformed themselves from provincial textile merchants into the indispensable bankers of popes and emperors. Their ascent was masterminded by Jakob Fugger, a man whose contemporaries knew him by a single, powerful epithet, the rich. Jakob understood that true influence lay not in owning land, but in controlling the flows of money and information. He built a financial and communications network so efficient that his couriers could often outpace the official messengers of kings. This system gave him an unparalleled advantage, allowing him to make bets on global events with a certainty others could only dream of. His most famous gamble was backing the Habsburg Prince Charles in his bid to become the Holy Roman Emperor. The election was a notoriously corrupt affair, a contest of bribes and promises. Jakob Fugger provided the funds that secured the votes, effectively purchasing the most powerful title in Europe for Charles V. In return, the Fuggers were granted immense privileges, control over lucrative mines, and the right to collect papal taxes across vast territories. Their wealth, drawn from silver and copper mines in Central Europe, became the fuel for Habsburg ambition, financing wars and propping up an empire upon which the sun never set. They even financed Portuguese voyages to the Indies, understanding that new trade routes were simply new arteries for wealth to flow back to them. The Fuggers demonstrated that a single family, operating from a single city, could alter the political destiny of a continent through the careful application of capital. They were the original architects of a system where finance and imperial politics were fused into one. Yet their immense, concentrated power also contained the seeds of its own limitation. The Fugger Empire was a personal one tied to the genius of Jakob and the fortunes of the Habsburgs. When those emperors failed to repay their colossal debts, the entire Fugger fortune trembled. This vulnerability revealed a fundamental truth that for global ambition to be sustainable, the risk could not rest on the shoulders of a single family. The Fuggers showed the world what was possible, but their model was too fragile, too personal. The next chapter of financial history would require a system where risk was shared and ambition was democratized, opening the door for an even more powerful and enduring institution. A single piece of paper, a share certificate, now held more power than a royal charter. The joint stock company was the financial revolution that truly globalized empire, transforming Conquest from a royal enterprise into a corporate one. In the 17th century, entities like the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company were far more than mere trading outfits. They were, in effect, private nations, granted astonishing powers by their home governments to raise armies, mint their own coins, establish colonies, and wage war. Their mandate was profit, and their methods were absolute. This new model solved the age-old problem of funding expensive overseas ventures by pooling the resources of thousands. A spice merchant, a wealthy widow, a ship captain, any ordinary citizen with a bit of spare capital could now own a tiny fraction of a company claiming vast territories on the other side of the world. This created an entirely new class of silent partner, the anonymous shareholder. These individuals, gathered in coffee houses to discuss stock prices, were collectively funding armies and fleets they would never see, governing people they would never meet. Their connection to the source of their potential wealth was purely financial, a line on a ledger. The immense distance between the investor in London and the reality in Bengal fostered a profound detachment. A shareholder could enjoy a dividend paid for by spices or textiles, completely insulated from the conflicts, the forced labor, or the complex political manipulations the company used to secure those goods. The corporation itself became a shield, absorbing the moral and physical risks so its owners did not have to. The entire system, however, depended on a fragile lifeline of information. How did a shareholder in Amsterdam know if their investment in a fleet sailing for the Spice Islands was safe? The value of their shares rose and fell on rumors, on captains' logs, on ledgers shipped across months of treacherous ocean travel. This created a new kind of hunger, a desperate need for reliable, timely news from the frontiers of trade. The corporations that mastered the flow of information, that could get word of a ship's safe arrival or a rival's defeat before anyone else, held an unbeatable advantage. They were not just trading in spices and silk, they were trading in knowledge itself, and that knowledge was the true currency of corporate power. But how did these distant outposts, these corporate states, actually function on the ground? What did it look like when a company, answerable only to its shareholders, began to rule? The price of a share in the British East India Company was more than a number on a ledger. It was a vote for a new kind of empire. What began as a modest venture to trade in spices and silks soon morphed into something far grander and more terrifying, a corporate sovereign state. Its army was larger than that of many European kingdoms, and its flag flew over territories it taxed and governed. This astonishing transformation was not funded by the British Crown's treasury, but by a sprawling network of investors whose collective belief and capital turned a trading post into a colonial power. On the floor of London's fledgling stock exchange, the company's shares became a barometer of imperial confidence. A victory in a distant Indian skirmish could send the stock price soaring, while a rumor of a lost ship could trigger a panic. The company's financial lifeblood was the dividend, a regular payment to its shareholders drawn directly from its profits. And as the company's power grew, those profits came less from simple trade and more from its right to collect taxes from millions of people in Bengal. This created a devastatingly efficient cycle. Revenue collected from Indian peasants was shipped back to London as profit, paid out to shareholders as dividends, and then reinvested by those same shareholders into new company bonds, funding more ships and more soldiers to conquer more territory and collect even more taxes. It was a financial engine that fed upon itself. Men like Robert Clive became legendary for the personal fortunes they wrested from this system, but their individual windfalls were fleeting compared to the enduring power of the shareholder base. The company's true strength lay in its ability to constantly tap into the savings of the British public, from the wealthy merchant to the modest shopkeeper, creating a society with a direct financial stake in the success of its corporate avatar overseas. This was a world away from the Fuggers financing a single emperor. Here, the relationship was not between a banker and a king, but between a faceless corporation and a marketplace. The risk was dispersed across thousands, and the ambition was limitless because it was fueled by the impersonal logic of the balance sheet. The company could borrow immense sums against its future tax revenues, betting on its own continued expansion. It was no longer just a company, it was a machine for turning territorial control into financial credit, and that credit into more territory. This model of corporate sovereignty, funded from the coffee houses of London, created an empire answerable first and foremost to its bottom line. While the British East India Company ruled lands, its Dutch counterpart mastered the market. The Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, known as the VOC, was not merely a company, it was a sovereign power engineered for profit on a scale the world had never seen. Its fleet was colossal, its army formidable, and its authority to wage war and negotiate treaties was granted by the Dutch state. But its true revolution was financial, creating a template for the modern multinational corporation that still echoes today. The VOC solved a critical problem that had plagued earlier ventures, the constant cycle of raising money for a single voyage and then dissolving the company to pay investors. Instead, it established a permanent capital base. When Dutch citizens bought shares, their money was not for one trip to the Spice Islands. It was a permanent investment in the company itself. This created a stable, enduring pool of wealth that the VOC could rely on for decades, funding everything from fortified trading posts to naval battles. To raise even more money without diluting ownership, the company pioneered the corporate bond, borrowing directly from the public with a promise of regular interest payments. This meant a baker in Amsterdam could own a piece of the company's future profits through a share, or he could act as its banker by purchasing a bond, earning a steady return for financing its global ambitions. The entire Dutch Republic, from wealthy burghers to ordinary craftsmen, became silent partners in this enterprise. Their collective savings built the ships and paid the soldiers that secured a monopoly on nutmeg and cloves. The profits from these spices did not just enrich a few merchants, they flowed back into the Netherlands, funding the very art and architecture that defined the Dutch Golden Age. The masterpieces of Rembrandt and Vermeer were, in a very real sense, painted with pepper profits. The VOC's need to manage this sprawling operation led to another profound innovation: sophisticated corporate governance. It had a board of directors, complex accounting methods to track assets and liabilities across continents, and a system of reporting that tried, however imperfectly, to bring order to a commercial empire stretching from South Africa to Japan. This was the birth of the corporate machine, a legal and financial entity that could outlive any single person and operate independently of the state that created it. The company was a vessel for collective ambition, a way for an entire society to project its economic power across the globe without ever leaving home. It demonstrated that the most effective empire might not be one held by a crown, but one owned by shareholders. A new kind of power was born not in a palace, but in a network. While corporate giants like the East India Company pooled the wealth of thousands, the 19th century witnessed the rise of a financial dynasty that operated with the speed and secrecy of a family firm on a global scale. The Rothschilds perfected the art of being the silent partner to entire empires. Establishing brothers in 5 key European financial centers, they built the first truly international private banking network. This was a revolutionary structure, allowing them to move money and information across borders with an efficiency that governments could only envy. Their legendary courier system, using fast boats and relay riders, often delivered critical news of battles or political shifts days ahead of official channels. This information was not just power, it was profit. The most famous example came during the final throes of the Napoleonic Wars. When the Duke of Wellington needed funds to keep his armies supplied, it was Nathan Rothschild in London who marshaled the capital, effectively financing the British war effort through private means. The survival of the British Empire in its most critical hour depended on the credit of a single family, but their influence extended far beyond wartime loans. The Rothschilds became the primary engine for the industrial infrastructure of empire. They financed the railroads that stitched continents together, moving troops and resources for the British in India and the French in Africa. They underwrote the government bonds that funded the colonization of vast swaths of Asia. Their capital built the mines and industries that extracted the wealth of conquered lands, binding global resources to European financial centers. The family operated with a discretion that was their trademark, understanding that the most effective influence is often the quietest. They demonstrated the peak of family-based financial control over geopolitics, a system where a few individuals, connected by blood and trust, could shape the destiny of nations from their private offices. Yet, this very model of concentrated personal power was already facing its own obsolescence. The scale of 19th century industrialization and global ambition was becoming too vast even for the mightiest family dynasty. The world was on the verge of a new financial revolution, one that would disperse power once again from the hands of a few families to the vast, impersonal forces of the public market. A government bond was a promise printed on fine paper, a promise that paid for the world. While corporate shares funded private ambition, sovereign debt became the lifeblood of public empire, allowing nations to spend colossal sums on conquest and infrastructure far beyond their immediate means. These bonds were essentially loans from ordinary citizens and large institutions to their own government, with the guarantee of regular interest payments. For the average British family, purchasing a colonial bond was a safe investment, a way to grow their savings steadily, but that steady growth was directly funded by the profits of empire. The interest payment deposited into a London bank account each quarter might have been earned from a new railway in India carrying raw cotton to the coast, or from taxes collected in a newly pacified region of Africa. The investor at home, comfortable and secure, became a direct financial beneficiary of a system they would never see, their personal prosperity now intertwined with the success of colonial projects thousands of miles away. This created a powerful, silent army of stakeholders back in the metropolitan heartland. Pension funds, universities, and countless middle-class households now relied on the steady, reliable returns that only a growing, profitable empire could provide. A political movement to end colonial expansion was not just an ideological debate, it was a threat to their financial security. The system cultivated a deep, self-reinforcing conservatism, where the public had a vested interest in maintaining the imperial status quo. The consequences for the colonies themselves were even more profound. Often, the very infrastructure used to control and exploit a territory was paid for by debt that was then assigned to the colony itself. The railway built to transport troops and export resources was not a gift, it was a loan. The administrative costs of a foreign government were not borne by the mother country. They were added to a ledger as a debt to be repaid by the local population. This created a devastating cycle of dependency. A colony could find itself burdened with a massive national debt it never asked for, used to fund its own subjugation, with the tax revenues from its people flowing out to service the interest payments to foreign bondholders. Managing this intricate, global web of financial obligations required a new kind of bureaucracy in the imperial capital. A rising class of civil servants, accountants, and financial managers now spent their careers tracking the flows of capital from the frontiers of empire back to the bond markets of London or Paris. Their calculations in quiet offices determined tax policies and budget allocations across continents, their work ensuring that the silent partners, from the largest bank to the smallest saver, continued to receive their due. This financial architecture, so clean and orderly on paper, masked a raw reality that the very tools of development and control were also the chains of perpetual obligation. The heart of this financial empire beat in a single square mile of London. The city, as it was known, transformed from a national marketplace into the central nervous system of global capital. Its institutions, the London Stock Exchange and the powerful merchant banks, did more than just move money. They manufactured the very trust required to fund ventures on the other side of the planet. This trust was the invisible currency that made everything else possible. A banker in Lombard Street could assess the risk of a diamond mine in South Africa, price that risk into a bond, and then sell shares in that enterprise to thousands of ordinary Britons. The capital pooled from these countless small investments provided the liquidity, the ready cash that kept the imperial engine running smoothly. At the center of this web stood the Bank of England. It acted as the ultimate stabilizer, its reputation backing the value of the pound sterling and guaranteeing the rock-solid safety of British government bonds. This created a virtuous cycle of confidence, where investors felt secure putting their savings to work in even the most distant and speculative colonial projects, knowing the full faith of the British state stood behind the system. The entire process was a marvel of financial abstraction. A clerk in London would stamp a certificate, and months later, a railroad would begin cutting its way through the Canadian wilderness. A ledger entry in a merchant bank would translate into new machinery for a Jamaican sugar plantation. The physical reality of conquest and extraction was funded by these quiet, paper-based transactions. This centralized system had a profound and often devastating effect on the colonies themselves. Their economic destinies were now shaped by decisions made in London boardrooms, based on cold calculations of global supply and demand. A colony might be encouraged to grow only one crop, like cotton or rubber, because it fit neatly into the city's investment portfolios, making its entire economy vulnerable to price swings on the other side of the world. The capital that built their infrastructure came with strings attached, binding them ever tighter to the financial heart of the empire. The city did not just fund the empire, it designed its economic blueprint, creating a world where the sun never set on British investments. The wealth of a continent was systematically rerouted into a ledger book. This was the final, brutal logic of the financial machine, a closed loop where the colonies paid for their own subjugation. The imperial engine required constant fuel, and it found it in the very lands it controlled, through meticulously designed systems of extraction. In India, the British established a land revenue system that transformed traditional farming into a relentless source of cash. Farmers were forced to grow cash crops like indigo and cotton for export, while the state collected a fixed, often ruinous, tax payable not in grain but in silver. This single policy generated the vast bulk of the revenue that paid for the entire colonial administration, from the salaries of British officials to the barracks of the sepoys in the army. Alongside land revenue, the state imposed monopolies on essential goods. The salt tax was perhaps the most infamous, a government stranglehold on a mineral vital to human life and preservation. By making it illegal to collect salt freely from the coast, the British could charge a price that squeezed every household, generating pure profit from a basic human need. This revenue did not stay to build local schools or hospitals. Instead, it was shipped across the ocean, entering the ledgers of the East India Company and later the British Treasury as sterling credit. This money then performed a circular dance. It was used to pay the dividends to the company's shareholders in London and to service the interest on the government bonds that had funded the conquest of India in the first place. A farmer in Bengal, struggling to pay his land tax, was unknowingly contributing to the quarterly interest payment of a bondholder in Edinburgh. This is the core of the drain of wealth theory, a process where resources were not just traded, but systematically and permanently transferred from the colony to the imperial center. The entire financial viability of the empire depended on this efficiency of extraction. To manage it, the British created one of the most intricate and impersonal bureaucracies the world had ever seen, an army of clerks and collectors whose sole purpose was to measure, assess, and collect. Their meticulous records quantified every acre of land and every pound of salt, transforming the complex lives of millions into neat columns of revenue and debt. This bureaucratic machine ensured the silent partners, the investors and bondholders thousands of miles away, continued to receive their steady, predictable returns, completely insulated from the human cost of their investments. The system was perfectly designed, but for whom? The very ships that carried tea from Canton to London were financed by a poison. In the early 19th century, the British East India Company faced a crippling problem. Its home market was addicted to Chinese tea and silks, but China had little interest in British manufactured goods. To balance its books and stop the drain of silver from its coffers, the company turned to a solution that would fuel one of history's most destructive trades. It cultivated vast opium poppy fields in India, auctioned the processed drug to private British merchants, and then financed the voyages of their clipper ships to the Chinese coast. The financial houses of London and Calcutta provided the letters of credit and insurance that made these risky voyages possible, transforming an illegal narcotic into a respectable commodity on a balance sheet. The profits were staggering. The silver the Chinese paid for the opium flowed directly back to the company, financing its administration and its armies in India. It then flowed onward to London, paying dividends to the company's shareholders and bolstering the British government's own tax revenues. An investor in England, reviewing their portfolio, would see only a line item for East India Company stock, or perhaps a government colonial bond, both performing admirably. The quarterly returns were steady and strong, a testament to sound financial management. They were completely insulated from the human cost, from the addiction-ravaging Chinese ports, from the social collapse and the imperial crackdowns that followed. The entire system was designed to sanitize the source of the wealth. A merchant in Calcutta saw not addiction, but a profitable crop. A banker in London saw not human misery, but a reliable stream of interest payments. The machinery of finance created layers of abstraction, turning a moral catastrophe into a column of credit. This raises a chilling question that echoes into our own time. When capital is so effectively divorced from the consequences of its investments, where does the responsibility lie? The silent partners of the opium trade were not mustache-twirling villains. They were ordinary investors trusting the market, unaware that their financial security was being underwritten by a foreign empire's despair. The system itself bore the blame, a financial architecture that could monetize human suffering without ever having to look it in the face. A map of Africa was carved up not by generals, but by bankers wielding speculative charts. The late 19th century scramble for the continent represented the purest form of financialized conquest, where the promise of future wealth on a prospectus was enough to justify the seizure of an entire territory. Chartered companies, granted immense power by their home governments, became the sharp end of this financial spear. Cecil Rhodes's British South Africa Company was a perfect example, a corporate entity with a royal charter that gave it the authority to administer a swath of land it named Rhodesia. Its mandate was deliberately vague, a license to exploit and govern, all in the name of profit for its shareholders. The engine of this expansion was a speculative fever that gripped European markets. Financiers in London, Paris, and Brussels raised capital by selling shares in these companies to an eager public. The sales pitch was always the same, the promise of unimaginable mineral wealth, of diamonds and gold lying just beneath the soil, waiting for the first European to stake a claim. These stories, often based on little more than rumor and hopeful exaggeration, created an investment bubble. The value of a company's shares would soar on news of a new geological survey, driving more capital into its coffers and financing more aggressive expeditions into the interior. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy, where the money raised from speculators directly funded the very conquests that made the speculation seem plausible. This model perfected a dangerous financial alchemy. The immense risks of sending armed columns into unknown lands, of fighting local kingdoms, and of building railroads through difficult terrain were all socialized. They were spread across thousands of individual shareholders who had bought a piece of the dream. If an expedition failed or a mine turned out to be a bust, the company might collapse, but the individual loss for any one investor was limited. The potential rewards, however, were privatized, flowing to the company's directors and the largest early investors. This system created a powerful incentive for reckless expansion, for drawing lines on a map with little knowledge of what they contained. The human cost of this process, the displacement of communities, the violent conflicts, and the imposition of harsh labor systems were simply not variables in the financial equation. A shareholder in London reading their newspaper might see a brief mention of a native uprising put down by company police, but their primary concern was the closing price of their shares that day. The sheer distance, both geographical and psychological, allowed the financial machinery to operate with a clean conscience, completely detached from the reality it was creating on the ground. This was the silent partnership at its most extreme, where capital could reshape a continent without ever having to set foot on its soil. The muskets at Lexington and Concord fired the first shots, but the real war for American independence was won with loans and letters of credit. This was a rebellion not just against a king, but against an entire financial system. The British fiscal military state, a machine perfected over a century, demanded that the colonies exist to feed its treasury. When Parliament imposed taxes like the Stamp Act, it was not merely a request for revenue. It was an assertion of ultimate financial control, a reminder that the colonists were subjects within London's economic orbit. Their defiant response, a rejection of taxation without representation, was a direct challenge to the very architecture of British imperial power. To fight this system, the revolutionaries had to build a new one from scratch. They needed their own silent partners. The Continental Congress had no power to tax, and the new states were reluctant to surrender their funds, so they turned to the printing press, issuing a flood of paper money called Continentals to pay soldiers and buy supplies. This was a desperate gamble, a currency backed by little more than the hope of future victory, and it quickly plummeted in value. The phrase "not worth a continental" entered the language as a bitter joke about financial collapse. The real salvation came from across the ocean. America's cause found eager backers in the courts of Europe, not out of love for democracy, but from a cold calculation of realpolitik. France, still smarting from its defeat in the 7 Years' War, saw a chance to cripple its British rival. The French crown, along with Spain and the Netherlands, began funneling millions of livres in loans and grants to the American rebels. This foreign capital was the lifeblood of the revolution. It purchased the French muskets that equipped the Continental Army, it funded the fleet that sealed the victory at Yorktown, and it bought the time Washington needed to keep his army in the field. Behind the scenes, men like Robert Morris, a Philadelphia merchant known as the financier of the Revolution, performed financial miracles. He used his personal credit to secure supplies. He chartered a bank to support the army, and he navigated the complex world of international diplomacy to ensure the loans kept flowing. He was America's first Treasury Secretary in all but name, a silent partner working to build a nation's financial foundations while the war raged. This dependence on foreign money, however, came with its own set of chains. The new United States was born deeply in debt, owing massive sums to European powers that now expected influence and favorable trade. The revolution had proven a profound truth, that political freedom was inextricably linked to financial independence. To break from one empire's web, America had been forced to spin its own, entangling itself with a new set of international creditors whose interests would shape the young republic's future for decades to come. A single London bank almost brought the entire imperial machine to a grinding halt. The year was 1890, and Barings Bank, one of the most respected names in global finance, the very institution that had once helped the United States purchase Louisiana, stood on the brink of insolvency. Its downfall was not triggered by a European war or a royal default. but by a financial crisis in a distant land it had bet its entire fortune on: Argentina. The bank had poured millions into Argentine loans and infrastructure projects, believing the South American nation's growth was limitless, when a revolution and a plummeting currency forced Argentina to default. Barings was left holding worthless paper. The news sent a tremor through the city of London. Barings was not some fringe speculator. It was a pillar of the establishment, deeply intertwined with the fortunes of countless other firms and investors. Its collapse would have been like a domino falling against the first in a long line, triggering a cascade of bankruptcies that could have frozen credit markets worldwide. The silent partners, it turned out, were profoundly vulnerable. Their wealth, built on global connections, was now threatened by a political upheaval thousands of miles away. In a moment of high drama, the governor of the Bank of England summoned the city's most powerful financiers to his office. The message was stark and simple: they had to save Barings to save themselves. A rescue fund was hastily assembled, a collective pool of capital contributed by rival banks who understood that their own survival depended on the stability of the system as a whole. This was not an act of charity, it was an act of collective self-preservation. The bailout was a landmark event, revealing a new and critical truth. The financial architecture of empire had become so vast and interconnected that no single private entity, no matter how mighty, could be allowed to fail. The state, through its central bank, was now the implicit guarantor of last resort. The silent partners still held immense power, but they could no longer operate in a vacuum of pure profit and loss. Their risk was now socialized, their potential failure a threat to the entire nation, forcing the very architects of the system to become its permanent guardians. This delicate arrangement, born from crisis, would define the relationship between high finance and the state for the next century. A private letter, carried by a fast ship and a trusted rider, was worth more than a chest of gold coins. In the high-stakes world of imperial finance, information was not just power, it was a direct and tangible asset. The silent partners understood that the first person to know a critical piece of news could leverage it into an unimaginable fortune, while the last to hear could be wiped out. This was a world without telegraphs or telephones, where the speed of a sailing ship or the endurance of a horseback courier dictated the flow of capital across continents. Banking dynasties like the Rothschilds built their own private intelligence networks, a web of fast clippers and relay stations that often outpaced the official mail of governments. A brother in Paris would receive word from a brother in Vienna days before the news reached the French court, giving the family a crucial window to act. This intelligence was not merely collected, it was weaponized. If a Rothschild agent learned that a war in Europe had ended favorably, the family could begin buying depressed government bonds before the market realized their value was about to soar. If they received a confidential report that a sugar harvest in the Caribbean had failed, they could quietly corner the market on remaining stocks. Their political clients, kings and ministers, relied on this financial intelligence as much as their own spies, creating a feedback loop where money and statecraft became inseparable. This need to control information extended all the way to the colonial frontier. The reports sent back to London by company agents and governors were meticulously crafted documents, designed not just to inform but to persuade. A minor military victory would be portrayed as a decisive pacification, a modest trading post as a gateway to untold wealth. The goal was to present a narrative of stability and boundless opportunity to the investing public back home. Unsettling truths about resistance, famine, or administrative chaos were filtered out or softened, lest they spook the shareholders and cause a run on the company's stock. The perception of risk was carefully managed, making a speculative venture in a distant land appear as safe as a bond from the British Treasury. Controlling this narrative was as vital to the imperial project as controlling the capital itself. It shaped the entire landscape of investment, turning the raw, chaotic reality of conquest into a clean, compelling story of progress and profit. The silent partners sitting in their London offices were not just reacting to events, they were acting upon a curated version of them, a fiction of stability that allowed the financial machinery to operate with confidence. But what happened when that curated narrative shattered, when the true cost of this distant finance suddenly became impossible to ignore? A library built with one hand can obscure what the other hand has taken. The same industrialists and financiers who amassed colossal fortunes from the engines of empire often became the greatest philanthropists of their age. Their names are etched in stone on the institutions they endowed: the Carnegies and the Rockefellers, patrons of public libraries, world-class universities, and vast museums. This grand giving forces a difficult question upon us. What was the true motive behind this generosity? For a man like Andrew Carnegie, whose steel mills produced the rails that bound continents and the plates that armored imperial navies, philanthropy was a core tenet of his personal philosophy. He famously argued that the wealthy have a moral duty to act as stewards for society, redistributing their surplus wealth in ways that promote the public good. He funded thousands of public libraries, believing knowledge should be accessible to all, a truly noble ambition, yet we cannot ignore the context of that wealth. The same industrial system that generated his fortune also relied on harsh labor practices and was deeply enmeshed in the project of global domination. His libraries offered self-improvement to the working man, even as his business interests were shaped by the same imperial markets that demanded raw materials and new infrastructure across the globe. So was this a quiet act of atonement, a salve for a corporate conscience, or was it something more pragmatic, a brilliant investment in social stability? Endowing a museum or a university did more than just burnish a reputation. It built a lasting legacy of cultural influence. It transformed raw capital into social capital, weaving the name of an industrialist into the very fabric of civic life. This created a powerful shield, a perception of benevolence that could soften the harsh realities of how the money was originally made. A town with a Carnegie library might look more kindly upon the owner of the local steel mill. A nation benefiting from Rockefeller medical research might be less inclined to scrutinize the monopolistic practices that built the fortune. Philanthropy could effectively launder a legacy, turning wealth derived from imperial extraction and industrial consolidation into monuments of public service. The duality is inescapable. The same financial architecture that could fund an opium war also built a world-class museum. The same corporate entity that imposed a harsh tax on salt also endowed a center for advanced learning. This does not make the library any less valuable to the community that uses it, nor does it make the museum's collection any less magnificent, but it complicates our understanding of these gifts. They stand today as permanent fixtures in our world, these beautiful, contradictory monuments. They are testaments to human generosity and to the immense power of concentrated capital, to a desire for a positive legacy, and to the often brutal systems that made such lavish giving possible. We are left to walk their halls and read in their libraries, forever grappling with the ambiguous conscience of capital. No empire was ever truly self-made. The grand story of national expansion, filled with heroic explorers and patriotic statesmen, is a powerful myth, but it is a myth nonetheless. The reality was far more pragmatic, a constant and intricate dance between the throne and the counting house. The state provided the legal framework, the flag, and the ultimate threat of military force. The financiers, in return, provided the lifeblood, the capital without which the ships could not sail, the soldiers could not be paid, and the colonies could not be built. This was not a simple transaction. It was a deep fusion of interests, a public-private partnership that spanned the globe. A royal charter granted to a trading company was not just a piece of paper. It was a license for a corporation to act with the power of a state, to make war and govern land, all in the service of profit for its distant shareholders. In exchange, the crown gained a powerful, semi-private arm to extend its influence without draining its own treasury, sharing in the wealth through taxes and tariffs. This symbiosis created a powerful feedback loop. The success of a company like the East India Company meant more tax revenue and global prestige for the British state. The military victories of the British state, in turn, opened new markets and secured new resources for the company and its investors. Their fortunes became permanently intertwined. This alignment of interests, however, came with a profound cost. Other considerations, like the welfare of indigenous populations or the long-term health of local economies, were systematically sacrificed on the altar of this shared goal. The pursuit of profit and the projection of power became one and the same mission. The romantic myth of the self-made empire deliberately obscures this messy, financialized reality. It hides the fact that many of the most famous imperial adventures were, at their core, speculative business ventures. It silences the crucial role of the anonymous shareholder, the bondholder, and the insurance underwriter, whose collective bets funded the entire endeavor. By pulling back this veil of national glory, we are forced to confront a more complex and less flattering truth. The global order was not forged by heroes alone, but by a powerful alliance between sovereigns and their silent partners, an alliance where the balance sheet was often the ultimate arbiter of destiny. The ledger books recorded the names of men, but the trust was often woven by women. Behind the great dynasties of finance stood a network of marriages, a hidden architecture of alliance that was as critical as any loan agreement. A wedding between two powerful families was not merely a social event. It was a strategic merger, a way to consolidate capital, share business intelligence, and create unbreakable bonds of loyalty. The woman at the center of such a union became a vital link, her correspondence and social connections forming a private information highway that ran parallel to the official channels of commerce. She was the glue that held the far-flung enterprise together, a constant presence in the family home while her husband or brothers traveled between financial capitals. Consider the role of a woman like Maria Sibylla Merian in the 17th century. While not a financier herself, her meticulous scientific work documenting the insects of Suriname, funded by her own family's merchant connections, provided invaluable practical knowledge for European planters and investors. In a more direct financial capacity, many women acted as de facto bankers within their kinship groups. They held power of attorney, allowing them to sign contracts and manage assets while their husbands were abroad for months or years at a time. As widows, they frequently stepped into full control of the family business, their names appearing on partnership agreements and investment portfolios. These women were not passive inheritors of wealth. They were active, savvy managers who understood the markets as well as any man. Their influence extended from the counting house to the drawing room. The social gatherings they hosted were not just parties, they were informal trading floors where deals were whispered and introductions were made. By cultivating relationships with other powerful families, they created a web of mutual obligation and trust that was essential for conducting business in an era before standardized contracts and commercial law. This invisible work provided the stability and social capital that allowed the male financiers to take colossal risks. A man could sail for the East Indies knowing that his wife was capably overseeing his affairs at home, from collecting rents to negotiating with debtors. She ensured the family's financial and social standing remained intact, protecting the foundation upon which all his global ambitions were built. This hidden dimension forces us to reconsider what we mean by a silent partner. The term does not only apply to the anonymous shareholder in a joint stock company. It also describes the woman who managed the complex household economy that supported her husband's ventures, the heiress whose fortune provided the seed capital for a new colonial charter, or the widow who deftly navigated a financial panic to preserve her family's legacy. Their story reminds us that financial power was never just a public spectacle of men in boardrooms. It was also a private, domestic affair, cultivated in parlors and sealed with marriage vows, enabling the vast and very public drama of empire to unfold. A bondholder in London collected his quarterly interest, completely unaware that it was funded by a famine in Bengal. This is the core ethical chasm at the heart of our story, the profound separation between the source of wealth and its ultimate beneficiary. Could that investor, a respectable gentleman perhaps concerned with his family and his local parish, truly be held accountable for a disaster unfolding an ocean away? The financial architecture of empire was designed precisely to make such a question seem absurd. The joint stock company was a masterpiece of moral insulation. When you own a tiny, anonymous fraction of a vast enterprise, your connection to its operations is reduced to a number on a page. You receive a dividend payment, a clean and simple transaction. You do not see the complex chain of events that produced it, the enforced monocultures that replaced food crops with cash crops like cotton, or the punitive tax policies that left millions vulnerable when the rains failed. Your responsibility is dissolved by the very structure of your investment. This was not an accidental byproduct. It was a necessary feature for attracting the capital of thousands of ordinary, morally conscious citizens. The system allowed people to participate in the profits of empire without having to confront its brutal realities. A Quaker opposed to violence could still own shares in a company that maintained a private army because the share certificate contained no mention of bloodshed. An evangelical Christian could earn returns from a trade that depended on exploitative labor because the ledger showed only revenue and expenses, not human suffering. This moral distance is not a relic of the past, it is the bedrock of our modern global economy. Your pension fund invests in index funds, which in turn own pieces of thousands of companies. Your retirement security is tied to complex supply chains that stretch across the globe, to factories and farms you will never visit. We are all, in a sense, the new silent partners. The historical precedent forces a difficult reflection upon us. If we condemn the Victorian investor for being willfully blind to the source of his dividends, what does that say about our own financial lives today? The ethical weight of capital has not disappeared. It has simply been distributed and disguised within an even more complex and opaque system. The real question is not whether those investors of old were guilty, but how we, armed with this knowledge, choose to navigate the same fundamental dilemma between profit and principle. A family name no longer guaranteed control over the world's capital. The 20th century brought a quiet revolution, one that saw the great banking dynasties gradually cede their direct influence to a new, impersonal force, the institutional investor. The Rothschilds and the Barings were no longer the only masters of the financial universe. Instead, the dominant silent partners became the pension funds managing the retirement savings of teachers and factory workers, the insurance companies pooling premiums from millions of policyholders, and the mutual funds that bundled the investments of ordinary households. This was a profound democratization of capital, but also a profound anonymization. The personal letter between brothers in London and Paris was replaced by the quarterly report from a faceless fund manager in New York or Tokyo. The source of money was now the collective savings of entire populations, managed not by a patriarch for his descendants, but by professionals bound by a legal obligation known as fiduciary duty. This duty required them to act solely in the financial interest of their clients, to seek the best return for the least risk. It was a rule-based system, governed by algorithms and investment committees, stripping away the personal loyalties and family strategies that had once defined high finance. This professionalization created a new kind of distance. A fund manager in Chicago could sell millions of dollars worth of bonds from a developing nation with a click, not because of a personal feud or a political grudge, but because a computer model indicated a slight underperformance against a benchmark index. The decision was clinical, dispassionate, and entirely removed from the human consequences on the ground. The power of individual families waned, but the power of finance itself did not shrink, it metastasized. The capital pools were now so vast, so deeply embedded in the global economy, that their movements could make or break national economies. A decision by a handful of large institutions to withdraw investment could trigger a currency crisis on the other side of the world. The silent partner was no longer a person you could name, it was a system you could not see. This evolution connects the opium traders of Canton directly to the modern stock market. Today, when you contribute to your retirement fund, you become a part of this centuries-old tradition. Your capital is pooled with that of millions of others, and it is invested by institutional managers into global corporations and government bonds worldwide. You are a silent partner in the modern empire of finance, a system whose relentless pursuit of return continues to shape our world from afar, its decisions echoing the old dynasties in a new, impersonal key. The echoes of those old counting houses can be heard in the hum of a modern trading floor. The patterns established by the silent partners of empire are not relics, they are the very bedrock of our global economy, simply operating under new names and with digital speed. Foreign direct investment, where a corporation builds a factory in another country, is the direct descendant of the chartered company establishing a trading post. Sovereign wealth funds, where nations invest their vast reserves abroad, function with the same strategic calculus as a Rothschild financing a foreign government's railway. The entire ecosystem of international capital markets, with its bonds and equities flying across fiber optic cables, is the evolved, high-speed version of the system that once funded colonial ventures through paper shares and slow-moving ships. This is not a coincidence, it is a historical continuum. The multinational corporation of today, with its private security, its vast lobbying power, and its ability to influence national policy, operates with a reach that would feel very familiar to the directors of the British East India Company. Its power is economic, but its consequences are profoundly political. The fundamental flow of capital has also remained strikingly consistent. Just as money once traveled from the City of London to fund plantations in the Caribbean or mines in Africa, capital today continues to move in vast rivers from financial centers in the global north to infrastructure and extraction projects in the global south. This investment is essential for development, yet it recreates an age-old dynamic where decisions made in distant boardrooms dictate the economic fate of nations thousands of miles away. The terms of a loan from an international financial institution can shape a country's entire social spending budget. The sudden withdrawal of foreign investment by a handful of large funds can trigger economic crisis, a modern echo of a sovereign default that once threatened to topple a banking dynasty. Recognizing this deep historical wiring does not mean today's systems are identical to their colonial predecessors, but it allows us to see past the surface-level changes in technology and terminology. It reveals that the core relationship between finance and geopolitical power remains as potent as ever. The players may have shifted from family banks to institutional asset managers, and the instruments may have evolved from handwritten bonds to complex derivatives, but the underlying structure, the silent architecture of global influence, was built long ago and continues to shape our world from afar. The true story of these silent financiers is not found in grand monuments, but in dusty paper trails. We know their secrets today only through the meticulous work of historians who act as detectives, sifting through mountains of forgotten documents. These archives, scattered across continents in libraries and basements, hold the fragile evidence of the financial machine. The records of the British East India Company alone occupy miles of shelving, a chaotic ocean of ledgers, ship manifests, and personal letters. Each page is a potential clue. A single invoice for a shipment of Spanish silver coins can trace a path from a mine in South America to a company coffers in Calcutta. A hastily scribbled letter between a London banker and his agent in Canton might reveal the terms of a loan that financed an entire trading season, all hidden within the polite formalities of business correspondence. This painstaking work of connection is how we move beyond the official story of empire, the one of glory and conquest, and uncover the raw financial gears that made it all turn. It reveals the unspoken agreements and the quiet pressures that never made it into the history books. A margin note in a ledger, a list of shareholders hidden in a court document. These fragments allow us to reconstruct the invisible architecture of global power. They remind us that history is not always a secret buried deep, but is often hiding in plain sight, waiting in a fragile piece of paper for someone to understand its true significance. The British approach to empire was a sprawling, decentralized affair, funded by the collective bets of its citizens. London's vibrant capital markets allowed risk to be spread across thousands of investors, turning colonial ventures into publicly traded commodities. This system was agile and could raise immense sums quickly, but it also meant that the driving force was often short-term profit for distant shareholders, not long-term state planning. The British East India Company was the ultimate expression of this model, a private entity that eventually governed millions, its policies dictated by the quarterly dividend. Across the Channel, the French system operated with a different logic. The French state itself was the primary actor, directing colonial policy from Versailles. While it used powerful private financiers and chartered companies, these entities were kept on a much shorter leash, their operations closely supervised by the royal bureaucracy. This centralized control could mobilize national resources with impressive efficiency for specific goals, like building a fortified port or funding a military expedition. Yet it also meant that French colonial ventures were more vulnerable to the shifting winds of royal favor and the state's own frequent financial crises, lacking the deep, resilient pool of private capital that buoyed the British. The Dutch, in contrast, perfected a hybrid model. The Dutch East India Company was a state in all but name, yet it was funded by the world's first truly public shareholders. Its innovation was permanence, locking in capital for the long term and creating a stable financial base that powered its ruthless monopolization of the spice trade. The entire Dutch Republic, from its richest burgher to its humblest artisan, had a financial stake in the company's success, aligning national and corporate interest to an unprecedented degree. Then there was the Spanish path, which looked almost medieval in comparison. Conquest was a royal enterprise, financed not by a stock market, but by the relentless flow of silver from mines in Potosi and Zacatecas. This direct control over the physical source of wealth gave the Spanish crown unparalleled independence, freeing it from the need to constantly negotiate with Parliament or shareholders. But this very independence proved to be a fatal weakness. The flood of silver created a false sense of security, discouraging the development of the kind of sophisticated financial markets that sustained its rivals. When the silver flows eventually slowed, the entire edifice of Spanish power began to crumble, revealing a system that was rich in bullion but brittle in its financial foundations. Each model, in its own way, demonstrates the enduring partnership between power and capital. The British leveraged a market, the French a centralized state, the Dutch a corporate public hybrid, and the Spanish a treasure fleet. Their successes and failures were not just a matter of military might, but a direct reflection of the financial architecture they built to pay for it all. A dividend notice arriving in a London townhouse bore no trace of the scorching sun or the backbreaking labor that had produced it. This was the psychological chasm that made the entire system function, the vast space between the comfort of the investor and the often brutal reality that generated their returns. A person of conscience sitting in a cozy drawing house could cash a dividend check from the East India Company without ever visualizing the Bengali farmer whose surplus grain was seized to pay for it. They could rejoice at a rising stock price for a Caribbean sugar venture without hearing the clank of chains in the fields. This disconnect was not an accident, it was carefully engineered. The reports that reached shareholders were masterpieces of selective information. They detailed tonnage of goods shipped and profits secured, but they omitted the famines triggered by forced cash crop cultivation or the violent suppression of local resistance. The human cost was systematically edited out of the financial statement, leaving only a clean narrative of progress and prosperity. Cultural prejudice further widened this gap. Many investors in Europe viewed people in colonized lands as fundamentally other, less civilized, or even destined for such labor. This dehumanizing lens made it easier to rationalize exploitation as a form of paternalistic development or simply the natural order of things. The most powerful tool of all, however, was the financial instrument itself. A share certificate is an abstract thing, a piece of paper with a number. It does not smell of sweat or carry the taste of salt from taxed tears. It transforms the messy, tangible world of production and suffering into a neat, impersonal figure on a balance sheet. This abstraction allowed for a profound moral dissociation. A deeply religious man who would never personally whip an indentured servant could without a second thought invest in a company that did. A philanthropist generous to local charities could draw wealth from a system that created poverty abroad. Their capital was doing the morally questionable work while they remained, in their own minds, upstanding citizens. This historical challenge of moral distancing has not faded away, it has simply evolved. Today, our retirement funds are invested in vast, opaque index funds that own pieces of thousands of companies. We click a button to buy an exchange-traded fund tied to emerging markets, completely unaware of the specific working conditions or environmental practices within that complex web. The modern investor, just like their historical counterpart, is often shielded from the true consequences of where their money travels, forcing us to ask how we can possibly make ethical choices when the connections are so deliberately obscured. The silent partners of empire were the indispensable architects of the modern world. Their capital was the mortar that built the global infrastructure we take for granted, the funds that raised the armies and paid the administrators who redrew the map of continents. This hidden financial machinery teaches us a profound and sobering lesson, that the most decisive forms of power are not always visible on a throne or a battlefield. They often reside in the quiet, paneled offices where risk is calculated and returns are measured. To understand our interconnected world, we must look past the flags and the treaties and into the ledgers. The legacy of these financiers is not a relic, it is the very wiring of our global economic system. We navigate a world shaped by their innovations in credit, their corporate structures, and their methods of managing risk across vast distances. We also inherit their ethical dilemmas, the perennial challenge of connecting capital to conscience when the source of profit is so often obscured by layers of abstraction. As you consider your own place in this vast economic web, whether as an investor, a saver, or simply a consumer, remember this history. It asks us to reflect on the power and the profound responsibility that comes with capital, even when it feels anonymous and distant. What do you think about this hidden history of finance and empire? Share your reflections in the comments below. And if this perspective on the past has given you a new way to see the present, subscribe for more journeys into the mysteries that shape our world.